Welcome to Philosophy 2200, Ancient Philosophy. Today we will be looking at the second part of our reading of Book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. We are going to begin at Chapter 7 of Book 1 and continue through Chapter 10. This is begins on page 9 of the required edition of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. If you're using a different edition, begin around 1097a, line 13 or so, chapter 7 of book 1. Okay, let's just remember where the heck we are from last time. Aristotle begins his ethics by noting that when you look around, you see a lot of people doing a lot of things. And one inference you can draw is that they are trying to realize good things for themselves in various ways. And this is why they're doing the various things they are doing. So in other words, human action is purposive. And the purposes, the aims, ends, or goals at which people are striving towards which they strive, are, have a certain kind of structure. Let's just put it that way. And we're going to get more discussion of the structure of human action in chapter 7. So let me just hold off on that for a minute. But in general, what he's getting at is most people are trying to accomplish X, Y, or Z, whatever that is, in a given day or moment. And ultimately, though, by asking the sort of why question, why are you doing this? What are you hoping to accomplish for whatever activity we're talking about? You can find out that many actions are instrumental in nature, that is, they're aiming at some goal that is external to the activity itself. However, some activities are not instrumental. They are instead what Aristotle calls complete or perfect. That is, they have their end or goal realized at every moment. And then finally, there are actions that are both instrumental and complete. Education being one, you're supposed to be learning. Learning is good in and of itself. If you're doing that, then your activity is completed at any moment in which you are doing that. In other words, right now, as you try to read and understand Aristotle, and I attempt to explain Aristotle, this activity is complete, whether or not we ever make it through the rest of Book 1. However, in another sense, right, we are trying to get through certain amounts of material, and you are trying to get through the semester, and you want to receive a passing grade, graduate from the university, etc. And so in a sense, even this activity itself of reading and talking about Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is both instrumental and complete for many of you, right? Because not only are you learning for the sake of learning, you are also learning with a specific goal in mind to pass a class, to obtain a degree, etc. So, different kinds of action, but all human action is ultimately purposive for Aristotle, and not just human action, but nature in general. The activity of nature in general is purposive for Aristotle. So, a lot of people are attempting to realize various goods, and ultimately they are trying to realize different conceptions of happiness, Aristotle claims. Some of these conceptions are better than others. Sensual pleasure is suitable for animals, Aristotle says, and human beings are rational animals, so it's double-sided, I guess, is his objection there. I think what he's getting at is, it's not wrong for humans to believe that some kind of sensuous pleasure is a part of their happiness. Insofar as we are animals, for Aristotle, this would have to be part of our nature. But he thinks it's ultimately going to turn out, and you don't really get this until the end of this whole entire work in Book 10, but it's ultimately that the pleasure, sensual bodily pleasure for Aristotle, is actually inferior to what he's going to eventually characterize as intellectual or contemplative pleasure. And he's makes some really good points to that effect. I mean, on the one hand, it just sounds like a typical philosophical position, critical of the body and of pleasures, and it is that in some ways, but he also has some really interesting objections and criticisms of the inconsistency of those who maintain that something like sensual or sensuous pleasure is happiness. So it's not just that he disparages it as a life suitable for cattle. He's going to have a stronger and more powerful objection at one point in the ethics here, which is very subtle, very interesting. He's going to ultimately argue that intellectual and contemplative pleasure are superior pleasures, both in their intensity, but also in the fact that they can extend sort of indefinitely, he says, whereas sensual pleasure leads to its opposite state often, right? For instance, you can enjoy having drinks, and then you can be sick because of drinking too much. You can enjoy eating pleasant food and then make yourself sick, and so forth, if you don't engage in those activities with the virtue of moderation, which is ultimately intellectual virtue, knowing when to say when. Okay, let's move forward to chapter 7, finally, enough with the preliminary remarks. Aristotle begins chapter 7 by noting that we should go back again. He says, to the good being sought, whatever it may be. Ultimately, it's going to be called happiness. It seems to be a different thing in each different action and art. And so, in other words, right, when we talk about human beings trying to accomplish the good or good, there are lots of different kinds of good, Aristotle's pointing out, right? And so it's still not clear what we mean when we say all human beings are sort of acting to accomplish the ultimate good for themselves. When we see such a variety and variegation of goods, it's not clear what it means then to say human beings are in pursuit of the good. Around line 20, 21 of 1097a, Aristotle writes, if there is some end for all actions, this would be the good that belongs to action. And if there is more than one such end, these would constitute that good. So if there is some end for all actions, in other words, if everything we do is aiming at something which has no further purpose beyond itself. And again, the way this works with humans in their lives is you ask people why they're doing what they're doing. They give you a reason, they give you an explanation. Eventually, you come to a point where they really can't explain or justify what they're doing any longer, and that's when you've arrived at their conception of ultimate good or happiness. Okay, so if there is some end for all actions, happiness or something like this, this would be the good that belongs to action. So any action will be good as far as it leads to that end. And if there is more than one such end, and ultimately it does seem for Aristotle there is more than one such end. There's a kind of contemplative, intellectual happiness, and then there's what he would characterize as a kind of political political oriented around, a political conception of happiness oriented around actions taken sort of in concert with other people in your community to achieve excellence in various ways. And political just means, we're talking about virtues such as justice. Accomplishing justice in your community would be an example of this kind of ultimate good for Aristotle. But there's another kind of ultimate good that is sort of separate and detached from issues of justice or of moderation or of anything in a community, and really just has to do with people contemplating the causes and principles that underlie everything, whether or not you have any kind of intervention into the life of your community. Okay, so here we are. We're still looking for a definition of happiness. Now he's going to go on in the next section of chapter 7 here to distinguish these different kinds of action. I've already summarized them for you. Let's just repeat, okay? One type of action is entirely instrumental. So there's 3 types of action, basically. Aristotle's saying one type, entirely instrumental. Why are you doing what you're doing? Think of a really dull, low-paying job that nobody really wants to do, but you do it for money or something. Go ask somebody, why are you doing this? It's for the paycheck. If they didn't have to earn that paycheck, if they suddenly had enough money to not have to work for the rest of their lives, they would not stay doing that job 1 second longer than they had to. That activity is purely instrumental, aiming simply at pay or something like this, okay? Or you can think of a classroom you're taking at the university, a class you're taking at the university. If this class is just a means to an end, in other words, if you have no interest in the material, no interest in the activities of the class, no interest in any of it, but it's something you feel you must do because there's a requirement or something like this, then that activity for you is purely instrumental, right? You just are doing it for the sake of something else, meeting a requirement. And if you didn't have to do that, if they would waive that requirement, there's the option to apply for a waiver or something like this. There was some way out of it, you would in an instant, right? Not do it if you didn't have to. Another category of action would be actions that are both instrumental and complete. Okay? And those actions, again, we can take some of the same things we just talked about. You can take a job. Let's take, again, a job that doesn't pay much now. Again, a job that, but unlike the first case, a job which maybe doesn't pay much, maybe isn't ideal, but it does involve something that you really enjoy doing, that you would do even if you weren't paid to do it. Now, there's an example, right, of a job. Let me think of an example. I can think of an example of people I knew, for instance, that worked at national parks and monuments. Sometimes we're just stuck in a little booth, basically making sure people paid their fees to enter or whatever, right? But here's a job where it's not that enjoyable at all times. It doesn't pay very well. It's not great. However, there are elements of it that are wonderful that you might be doing even if you weren't being paid, such as, I don't know, taking a scenic drive through a national monument, such as being outdoors in nature and enjoying nice weather, such as hiking, um, observing wildlife, plants, etc. So, in other words, right, this could be a kind of job where, in one sense, the activity is instrumental. You wouldn't be there doing the job if you weren't getting paid for it. Right, so if you didn't have to earn a living, you wouldn't do it. However, some of those activities you do at that job are activities you might do anyways, even in your leisure time. And so, right, hiking in the forest or taking a scenic drive somewhere and enjoying the view. So, in that sense, then some of the activities there would be what Aristotle calls complete. And you can imagine, right, sort of ambivalent kind of occupation where some of the times what you're doing does feel fulfilling, and you'd be doing it even if you weren't getting paid, right? You enjoy it that much. Whereas other parts are purely instrumental, just to earn a paycheck. Now, note on the top of page 10, around line 28 or so of 1097a, Aristotle's going to say it's manifest the highest good is something complete. What this means for him is any activity that is purely instrumental cannot qualify as constituting human happiness. In other words, right, if your experience at work or in the classroom is what I described a moment ago as purely instrumental, then these activities can never be fulfilling for you, can never help you achieve happiness. They're going to be only done for the sake of something else, something that is different than them. Okay, now finally there are activities that are just complete and are not instrumental. Okay? A thing that is pursued on account of itself, as Aristotle puts it around line 31 or so of 1097a. A thing that is pursued on account of itself is more complete than a thing pursued on account of something else. And what is never chosen on account of anything else, in other words, what is done for its own sake alone, is more complete than things chosen both for themselves and on account of something else. In other words, activities that are both instrumental and complete. Hence, in an unqualified sense, the complete is what is chosen always for itself and never on account of anything else. Happiness seems to be of this sort most of all. We always choose it on account of itself, never on account of anything else. While everything else we would choose and hope for, such as honor, for example, will be chosen on account of themselves, but also for the sake of happiness. Supposing we will be happy by these means. However, as he points out, right, nobody chooses happiness as a means to something else. Okay, so he's given us one criterion here of happiness. Whatever it's going to be complete. It's going to be a kind of activity where, when you're doing it, there's no other further activity that you hope to be able to do on the basis of this complete activity. In other words, it will be complete, it will be final, another way to put it. There's nowhere else you'd rather be, nothing else you'd rather be doing. And this activity, whatever it is not something that you have to do so that later, tomorrow, or in a few hours, you can then do something else on its basis. Okay. There are many, we can think of lots of examples of activities that are complete in that way, right? Somebody who's really enjoying themselves simply dancing. That would be an example, right? To dance, to make music, to play a game, even, is going to be complete in this sense. And to simply contemplate the universe and wonder why it is the way it is. There are going to be many versions of this kind of complete activity. Oh, okay, now further down on the page 10 here, we get another criterion for happiness, self-sufficiency. What does he mean by this? He says, around lines 9 and 10 of 1097b, by the self-sufficient, we don't mean something that allows you to live in isolation from other human beings and not need anything from other human beings. No, we're not talking about this, not the self-sufficiency of a hermit, as he puts it. Instead, around line 13 or 14, we set down as self-sufficient that which by itself makes life choice-worthy and lacking in nothing. And such a thing we suppose happiness to be. Lacking in nothing, I think, is the crucial point here, right? There's nothing missing in this activity, where if that missing thing were added, the activity would be better. That's all he means here. So when he says self-sufficient here, it's another way of talking almost about completeness, frankly. There is nothing missing. So when he calls completeness, teleon, perfection here, what he means is you're doing it for its own sake and not for the sake of something else. When he talks about self-sufficiency, what he means is the activity you're doing is not missing anything that would make it better than it already is. That's all. Okay, and these two criteria, then, he thinks, have to characterize happiness. Now, let's look, though. On the bottom of page 10, onto the top of page 11. He says, to claim that happiness is complete and self-sufficient in the way that I just have, Aristotle notes, is obviously something undisputed. Most people would say, yeah, Aristotle, when I think of happiness, whatever the heck it is, you're right. It's something where, it's something I do because I enjoy doing it, and I'm not trying to get anywhere else or do anything else with my activity other than realize my potential and manifest something like excellence or virtue. Fine, and it's also an activity that is lacking nothing. There's nothing missing from this activity. So these, are still formal criteria, and we still haven't gotten to the substance of what the activity of happiness actually is. Right? As Aristotle puts it, around line 22 or so of 1097b, it still begs to be said in a more clear and distinct way what happiness is. This might come about readily if one were to grasp the work of a human being. The ergon, the function, the work, the task, the thing we are made to do is a way of thinking of what he's talking about here. Made, let's leave that out of the question here, made by whom, and etc. But as he puts it, just as with a flute player or a sculptor or any artisan, craftsperson, generally with those to whom some work or action belongs, the good and doing it well seem to be in the work, that is the activity itself. So too it would seem to be the case with a human being, if indeed there is some work that belongs to the human being. Is there some sort of work? And he's going to say, look, everything in nature and everything in art has a function and a purpose. Wouldn't it be odd if human beings, as beings, didn't have such a function or purpose or work? An eye's work is to see, a hammer's work is to pound in nails. What is the work of being a human being, is what he's asking here. So on page 11, what in the world would this be, this work of being the human being, just above 1098a? For living, here's a candidate, right? Maybe the purpose of being a human being is to live. Living seems to be shared even by plants. But we're looking for what it is that, is the task, work, or function of the human being. So it's too general of an answer to say the purpose of life is to live, is to stay alive. Life just wants to stay alive and survive. Aristotle's point is, well, that's true of all life. We're trying to figure out what the work or task is of human beings specifically. So yes, human beings, living is part of the function or work of being a human being. Yes, but it's not specific enough. Okay. Therefore, one must divide off the life that consists in nutrition and growth. So, living is something that is unique and peculiar to plant life in particular. It's all plants can do, is to live and reproduce themselves, according to Aristotle. Right? They have a certain kind of motion and growth, from the seed to the full-grown plant to the withering and dying away, etc. But the activity that plants are meant for Aristotle is in a kind of flourishing, right? They flourish as whatever, and then they diminish and die, and then a new sort of generation takes its place, and that's it. Now, what else might be the, the, the work of the human being? Well, following this would be some sort of life that consists in perceiving. But this seems to be shared in by a horse and a cow and by every animal. So now we're kind of back to what is proper for an animal nature: perception, sensation, and the sensuous enjoyment that comes along with that. So in other words, right, using our senses. But Aristotle's claim here is that this is actually characteristic of the function of animal life in general. So in other words, we still haven't gotten to what is the function of human beings. Instead, we now have a general conception of the function of animals in general. Now, humans are animals, but they are animals unlike all other animals, or at least unlike most other animals, as far as they have what Aristotle calls logos. And so, simple sensual perception, like sensuous perception, the use of our sense organs, and the pleasure we get through using various sense organs in our bodies is not going to be specific enough again. It's going to be part of the picture for us, but it's not the essential part. What is the essential part? What remains, this is at 1098a, about 2 or 3, what remains is, he's arrived at his answer by a process of elimination here. What remains is some sort of life that puts into action that in us that has articulate speech. So, a sort of life in which logos, as he puts it, which can be language, articulate speech, and reason, a sort of life in which logos is put into action. That is going to be his answer. Okay. Of this capacity, logos, one aspect is what is able to be persuaded by reason, while the other is what has reason and thinks things through. So there's different kinds of reason and rationality. Children, for instance, have a rational nature for Aristotle, but it's a rational nature that is the capacity to be persuaded by reason. They don't yet have the capacity, okay, to actively reason themselves and think things through, at least not without help. And they certainly, are not developed enough to do it successfully most of the time or something like this. I think that's the idea. This is the purpose of the distinction, though. I think what he's getting at is there are people who maybe aren't able to reason actively and think things through on their own, and yet they still are capable, children, for instance, of being persuaded by reason. And they are thus rational animals that are still fundamentally different from any other animal. Right? You don't try to persuade the animals in the farmyard to do anything, right? You might crack a whip or something on them, but you're not going to go up to a bull and whisper something into its ear to try to persuade it to do something. Why? Because it's pointless, right? Pointless to talk to an animal and expect it to understand you, but it's not pointless with a child. So even a human being who's, for instance, not yet able to actively reason and think things through on their own is still able to be persuaded by reason. All right. But now he says, even when we think about reasoning and thinking things through actively, he says, since this is still meant in two ways, one must set it down as a life in a state of being at work, since that's the more governing meaning. And what he's getting at there is, of course, it's entirely possible to be able to actively reason and think things through, but what if, for various reasons, you're not doing that? Well, then nobody would characterize someone with that potential who's not actualizing their potential as happy, as fulfilling themselves, right? So what he's getting at here then is, I think what he's getting at here is he's narrowed things down, and he's claiming that happiness is a life that activates our capacity for logos, which is being translated as reason here, and articulate speech and whatnot, language, reason. So he's narrowing this down, and then he wants to make it as precise as possible. It's not just that human happiness is going to be an activity in which humans actualize or make real their capacity for logos, for reason and articulate speech. It's actually going to be the activity of doing that, and not the mere potential or capacity to do it. That's all. That's the point there. And this comes back to what he said earlier, right? About, sculptors and artisans, right? The good and doing it well seem to be in the work and in the doing of it, not in, the ability to do it. As Aristotle elsewhere puts it, right? When you go to the Olympics, they don't give the gold medal in wrestling to the biggest person present. They give it to the person who gets in the ring and wins. There might be somebody in the audience twice as big. That person doesn't get the award simply because they seem to have the potential for the gold medal. You got to get in there and do it, Aristotle's saying. Okay. So we come to his definition of happiness then here in chapter 7 of book 1. If the work of a human being is a being at work, an activity of the soul in accordance with reason, if this is so, go a few lines down to about line 13 or so of 1098a. If this is so, and we set down that the work of a human being is a certain sort of life, a life in which we activate and make active logos, reason, articulate speech, while this life consists of a being at work of the soul and actions that go along with reason, and it belongs to a man of serious stature to do these things well and beautifully. In other words, like, this is a serious business here. You only have one life. This is your chance to accomplish something. If you don't do it, you don't get another chance. So if all these things are true, if this is so, as he puts on the top of page 12, the human good, or happiness, comes to be disclosed as a being at work of the soul in accordance with virtue. And if the virtues are more than one, in accordance with the best and most complete virtue, intellectual virtues, contemplative virtues ultimately, but also this must be in a complete life. This is going to be crucial for chapter 10 if we ever make it there. Complete life. For one swallow, that is a certain kind of bird, does not make a spring. You see a bird nesting in a tree, doesn't mean spring's already here. Nor one day of supreme activity in which you realize all your potential, right? One day doesn't make for a complete life. Okay? There was a day as a child where I dominated a basketball game, right? That was just one day. I might have thought at that day when I was 8 years old or something that I was about to become the next star basketball player for the Chicago Bulls. It never happened. That was just one good day. I had a good game one day. I had a good game on the football field one day as well. I had a few good days there. I might have thought at those days, right, that I was realizing my potential to be a professional athlete, which I aspired to at that time, right? That was just a lucky day, a good day, and I think that's what he's getting at, right? We can have good days. There can be days where we do realize our potential. But if they're just days here and there, if it's just on the weekend or something like this, it's not going to be what he's calling here a complete life. A life where this activity of realizing logos, reason, articulate speech is manifested in a consistent and continuous manner and really can characterize our life as a whole. So having a few good days, living for the weekend, making the most out of your 2-week vacation every year, not going to cut it for happiness, according to Aristotle. Okay, let's take a break for just a moment. All right, let's pick up at chapter 9, Sally. We're going to have to skip ahead a little bit here just to make some headway. And so, to look at here in chapter 9, let's just start at the beginning. There's an impasse about whether happiness comes by learning or habit or training of some other kind, or else it comes to one side by some divine lot or even by chance. He's going to basically rule out. He's going to kind of proceed again by considering all the wrong answers first and then arrive at the right answer by a process of elimination. We know for Aristotle that learning, could be a part of happiness, but is not going to guarantee it. Habit, right, the formation of habits, is going to be important. Divine lot and chance, not going to be important. Training, in a sense, is also going to be important for Aristotle. So there are some better answers here and worse answers, right? The important thing I want to note here on page 15, right around, line 22 or so, is this claim. Things in accordance with nature occur naturally in the most beautiful possible way, right? And we would think then that human beings achieving happiness are acting in accordance with their nature, right? In other words, our nature, just like plants' nature is to flourish and bloom. The nature of a human being is to, in a sense, have its capacities for logos, reason, articulate speech, flourish and bloom, right? And so, if human beings, like any natural being, are supposed to naturally occur in the most beautiful possible way, well, the question then is, what the heck is going on with human happiness? Why are so few people achieving it? Why are so many people getting it wrong, right? What's the holdup? So, let us go a little bit further down, where he's going to clarify a little bit on what he's talking about. What is being sought? Happiness. It's further illuminated by our formulation. This is right around, 25 or so, line 25 or so of 1099b. What is being sought is further illuminated by our formulation. For happiness was said to be a certain sort of being at work, an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, that is, an excellent activity of the soul, involving reason or logos, right? So an activity involving logos, and it's happening in your soul, and that is, it's not something necessarily that it happens outside of your mind or soul, or at least the crucial part of it, while all the other good things, everything else that we call good, are either conditions that need to be present for happiness or else things that naturally assist the work and are useful as tools. These things would also be in agreement with what was said at the beginning. We set down that the highest good is the end of politics. In other words, politics aims to secure these other good things, these conditions that need to be present for happiness, and things that assist the work of human happiness and are useful as tools. That's the purpose of politics for Aristotle. Okay? And so politics aims to produce citizens of a certain sort, namely ones that are good and inclined to perform beautiful actions. This is a real problem today in the United States, because this does not seem to be happening, hasn't happened in the longest time. Producing citizens of a certain sort, namely today, citizens who are completely unable to distinguish truth from falsehood, sound information from a conspiracy theory, right? And also unable to perform beautiful actions as well. But this is the goal of politics when politics functions as it should, according to Aristotle, is it kind of sets up the playing field for human beings to then go and play and flourish on that field, right? So it gets all the ingredients, the material ingredients, you might say, of happiness, all the things we need to live these fulfilling lives. Politics' goal is to provide these things for citizens. Make sure they are provided for. It's reasonable then that we do not speak of a cow or horse or any other animal as happy, since none of them is able to share in being at work in such a way. We don't need to necessarily disparage animals, and I also think it's presumptuous on Aristotle's part to tell us what animals can and can't do. I mean, yes, he's observed animals at length. He's perhaps the first zoologist in history. However, you know, I feel like we don't necessarily need to, just because we can't maybe characterize a cow or horse as happy. I'm not even sure that's true, but in any case, what is he getting at here? You know, he's getting that human beings live in communities that are unlike even the most sociable of animal communities. Something like that. Something fundamentally different happens in human communities that does not happen even in animal communities that reveal a high degree of organization and division of labor, right? You can spend the rest of your life observing ant colonies and bee colonies, and you'll see an amazing social structure there. But one thing you won't see is what Aristotle is calling politics here, right? Here's an example of how you can know this. The beehive and the ant colony as they exist today are largely unchanged from what they were in Aristotle's time. Human political communities have transformed and changed profoundly since Aristotle's time. Humans are up to something different than simply repeating the same static forms over and over again. Okay, so moving along then, we are in chapter 9 of book 1. For this reason, Aristotle says a child's not happy either, since a child is not yet capable of performing the kinds of actions Aristotle has characterized as realizing our potential here for rational activity. Children who are called happy are pronounced blessed on account of our hope. Fair enough, right? Adults, yeah, this is, I'm not sure that our language maps on the way Aristotle's does here. In any case, what he's getting at is, just to be clear, we've defined happiness as putting into action logos that is in our soul and doing it well. Children cannot be expected to do this well, and therefore they are only called happy because of their potential to later become adults who will realize their potential. There is need, as he says, of both complete virtue and a complete life. So there's the other thing. It's not just that they're not capable of the kinds of activities that Aristotle is going to call the activities that constitute human happiness. It's also that they haven't lived long enough to accomplish great things. And therefore, again, they can't be expected to have accomplished happiness then. There is need for happiness to be real in our lives of both complete virtue and a complete life. For many changes and all sorts of chances, all sorts of twists of fortune come about in the course of a life, and it is possible for the most thriving person to fall into great misfortunes in old age, just as the story is told of Priam in the epics about Troy. To be clear, just spell this out, Priam is considered to have lived as fulfilling a conventional life as you can imagine. He's as rich as anybody can be. He is as powerful as anybody can be. He has been married to a beautiful, well-regarded woman for as long as anybody can remember, and he's had more children than almost anybody can count. And he has had the best possible life that they could imagine at this time. But there was one problem. His life doesn't end well. Everything that he had, he loses, one by one, basically, until he's literally watching his last infant son being thrown off the battlements and is left with absolutely nothing. And so the idea is, well, the first 72 years of his life might have been awesome, and everybody would have wished to maybe be him for the first 72 years of his life, but that last year or two was really bad, so bad that anybody in their right mind would not want to be him, because as well as it might have gone for Priam for 72 years or so, the last few years were terrible. And when we think about a happy life, we also think about the end of that life and how that life ends. Okay, just like anything that is complete. Okay, such as a story, such as a song, such as a piece of music, etc. Right? If you're listening to a piece of music and it's really good, that's nice, and you enjoy it, right? But what if you get to the last minute or so and it's terrible all of a sudden? Are you going to want to keep listening to that song? Maybe not, right? It was a good song and then the end was terrible. Or if you're watching a television show such as Lost, and the first few seasons are really good and they're getting you hooked and you're caught up in the mystery, and then it gets worse and worse and the end is just pathetic and garbage, and it turns out the story wasn't really well conceived and structured and it fell apart at the end. The idea is that changes your opinion really of the whole thing. And it should change your opinion of the whole thing, and it's the same with life, Aristotle's saying, okay? It's not over till it's over. However good it has gone, it could still turn out terribly. This is just how it goes, and when we think about happiness, we think about something that is complete, something that doesn't doesn't fall apart completely at the end. Okay, chapter 10. This then leads to a sort of paradox that Aristotle is going to consider at length in chapter 10. Sadly, we don't really have time to go through this in detail, but maybe that's a good thing. Okay, let's look at the question at the very beginning of chapter 10, top of page 16. Ought one to call no other human being happy either, who is still alive? Is it necessary, as Solon said, to look at the end? If that's true, though, is anybody happy once he's dead? What's he getting at here? Well, he's saying that if happiness requires a complete life, and if that means, right, that it has to end well too, does that mean we can't call anybody happy so long as they are alive? Solon, whose epithet is the wise, so maybe we should pay attention to what he has to say, did say something like this, famously in Herodotus and perhaps elsewhere. We should not count anybody happy until they have died, because until they're dead, their life isn't over, and until their life's over, we can't actually judge it as a whole. Now, Aristotle's reply here, though, is, well, okay, Solon, that sounds wise, but if we agree with you, does that commit us to the position that a person is only happy once they've ceased to live? That would lead then to the paradoxical implication that only the dead are happy. Right? And again, Aristotle's defined happiness as a human activity. So unless the dead are actually engaged in activating logos here, it's not going to work for him to say that only the dead are happy. Okay, so what does this lead then Aristotle to do? Well, let's try to restate the dilemma he's considering in chapter 10, further down, just before 1100b, a few lines before 1100b begins in chapter 10. If in fact one ought to look to the end of a life, for instance, to look to the end, and at that time judge each person, right? Blessed, sure. Not as being blessed, but as having been so before. In other words, now that you've made it all the way through life, we've seen how your life has ended, and everything has gone well. Now we can say, not that you are blessed, but that your whole life, now, finally, at the end, can now be safely judged to have been blessed. He says, how is it not absurd if, when someone is happy, what belongs to him cannot be truly judged as his, because one does not want to call the living happy on account of reverses of fortune, and because one assumes happiness is something durable and not at all easily changed, while fortunes often come back around again for the same people. Now, it's clear, he says, if we were to follow along with the fortunes, we would often call the same person happy and miserable in turns, right? So Priam, for instance, happy, blessed for almost his entire life, miserable at the end, right? Now, for Aristotle, though, this would have the implication that the happy person would turn out to be a kind of chameleon or a structure built on rotten foundations. And he doesn't think this can be right. He really doesn't. It just seems like If fortune or something like this is ultimately in charge of whether a person is happy or not, then your commitment to activating logos and manifesting it in your action is going to be subject to being overridden by turns and twists of fortune all the way up until the last moment of your life. And so, is following these fortunes not right at all, Aristotle asks, around 1100 B6 or so. And he says, yeah, we don't have to follow these fortunes. Here's what we have to notice, right? And so let's skip ahead now to 1100 B23 or so. Since many things happen by chance, going all the way from the great to the small, right? A bird can, crap on you from up above in the air. That's a small misfortune, right? Not a big deal. It's not going to destroy your life, right? It's just going to be annoying. You can trip and fall, for instance, and have to pick yourself back up. Maybe you've scraped your knee. But of course, really bad things can also happen by chance. You can be stricken with a terminal illness and all sorts of things, right? Since many things happen by chance, going all the way from the great to the small bits of good fortune, and similarly those of the opposite sort, small bits of misfortune, are clearly not decisive. And that's true, right? Lots of good little things happen, both good and bad, throughout people's lives. Those things don't make the difference here, he's saying. But if great ones come along, and here let's think about great misfortune as happened to Priam at the end of his life. Great misfortunes come along, and many of them, they will readily make one's life. Well, actually, here he's thinking about good fortune. Here's the thing. If it turns out the opposite way, just a few lines down, I think this is more constructive and interesting, right? Because I think, we don't need to worry about the illusion that, for instance, winning the lottery will make a person happy. Many naive folks have a conception like that. If I could just, get rich, all my problems would go away. But of course, it's not at all the case. And I think just even on the surface, that's an absurd position to adopt. And there's so much counterfactual evidence to that it's not even worth considering further here. But I think the real problem is, somebody who's lived a good life, who has striven and achieved great works and is as excellent as they can be, is subject to misfortune, great misfortune, all the way up until the end of their life. So that's a real problem, right? If it turns out, as he said, if it turns out the opposite way, that is, if great misfortune falls upon somebody who is living as well as they can and achieving their potential as well as possible, okay? If it turns out the opposite way, this limits what is blessed and mars its dignity, since it imposes pains and hinders many ways of being at work. Excuse me for just... All right, with that small misfortune out of the way, where were we? So if ways of being at work, as he puts it, govern our lives, and he does, he thinks we form habits, we become who we are by sort of habituating ourselves to do certain things. And if this is what governs our life, the kind of characteristic activities we devote ourselves to, no one who is among the blessed could become miserable. In other words, people who devote themselves to the kind of virtuous actions Aristotle is talking about throughout the Nicomachean ethics, and who make it sort of their second nature to just do these things every day, who habituate themselves to virtues, all right, he's saying such a person cannot become miserable, since, as he puts it, such a one will never do base or hateful things, will never do evil, may suffer misfortune, but will not do evil, and will bear all fortunes, even the bad ones, gracefully, and will always act in the most beautiful way the circumstances permit. This is a good general, will make the best use for war of the terrain that is at hand. And the shoemaker will make the most beautiful shoe out of the leather that is given. Right, a terrible general is going to say something like, sorry, I can't meet you guys on the field for battle because the conditions aren't right. It's raining, it's muddy. Let's wait till tomorrow and the conditions are better. This isn't a football game, right? Like, that's the idea, right? A general takes the terrain and does the best, comes up with the best plan for victory. A shoemaker takes the leather that is given and makes the best shoes. The same with all other artisans as well, and what Aristotle is saying, and it's the same with life. You do the best you can with the circumstances you're in. Even in the worst circumstances, you bear them as gracefully as possible. Neither would such a person, that is a person devoted to virtue, who has made virtue and the realization, the activation of these virtues manifest in rational activity and beautiful activity, neither would such a person be changeable and easily thrown off balance. He will not easily be dislodged from happiness, even by misfortunes, unless, and there is a caveat here, a qualification, unless they are many and great. So this is the element of kind of realism in Aristotle's account here. When really bad things happen over and over again to a really good person, such a person can't be dislodged from happiness. So in other words, this is a kind of a response to the position of Socrates and others, right? The idea that nothing evil can befall a good person. I think what Aristotle's saying is, well, hold on here, okay? If enough bad things happen, this good person is not made evil, but also is not able to be supremely happy. That is, Socrates' calmness in the face of being sentenced to death, his calmness in the face of being poisoned, is not something we can generalize as a rule for all human beings. That certainly seems plausible enough. So, however, even a good person who's realizing virtue as well as they can and does suffer many and great misfortunes, well, they can be dislodged from happiness, but, as he says, such a person would not become happy again in a short time, but if they are able to become happy again at all, in the fullness of some long time in which one had come to devote oneself to great and beautiful causes. In other words, you can pick yourself back up again and rebuild. But you can only do this, right, clearly, if there's still time left to you. If there isn't time left to you, and this all happens at the end of your life, like Priam, it's not clear that you're going to be able to be called happy and be happy and have lived a happy life. Anyways, I think that's enough for today with all of this. It's really just a springboard for thinking about how human happiness is related to things that are within our control and outside of our control, and how much do the things outside of our control that he is here calling fortune dictate and determine whether or not we'll be happy. How much of our happiness is up to us, how much is not up to us. Aristotle is ultimately saying something like the really important stuff is up to us. Yes, terrible things can happen and they can hinder us, but these are like falls you might take while racing. And the idea is you can pick yourself up. If you're racing and you fall, you don't necessarily have to give up the race just because you've fallen. You can pick yourself up again, dust yourself off, begin racing again. It might take a little while to get going and get up to speed or something, but the idea is it can happen again. Okay, good for today. That's plenty. Thank you for joining me.